Thanks. So we start each Global Dev Communicators Connect with sharing a little bit about the things that are stirring our soul right now. That's how we begin introductions. It's how we begin to know each other in this space. We actually then collate and put all of that inspiration together and also offer that on the Healing Solidarity Collective. And so I'm going to ask you all today just to share what is stirring your soul right now. And that could be anything. It could be a piece of art. It could be, for me, it is literally the birds. I live in a place with 4 seasons and we are entering spring and it feels amazing right now. It is like the giddiness of being in love. It's just wonderful. So I'm going to put that in the chat. And that is the curated list is right there. And if you could just introduce yourselves via the chat this way as well. So who are you and where are you in the world? And what is a piece of writing, art, performance, music, anything that has stirred your soul recently? If you could share that in the chat, it'd be great to know that about you all. Welcome, Joelle. Glad to see you. Okay, so as we get started, just to share some aims for this session and why we gather each month as Global Dev Communicators. We're here to connect to each other. We want to build community because we're all involved in ushering in a big narrative change, and we need support in doing that. And we really understand that creativity is a source of individual and collective healing. And we really just want to explore how imagination can shape our leadership together. And then, of course, there's just some wisdom, some knowledge, some ideas of really practical steps, as well as big dreams held within this group. And that's all important when it comes to shifting the narratives from charity to solidarity. So a few ideas that guide us as a group that I just want to share. We all have something from interacting with each other today. So we're here with a spirit of learning, not critique. We also consider this space to be a brave space, not necessarily a safe space. At Healing Solidarity, we feel like the good stuff's at the edge of the comfort zones. So we're going to go there. We also want to operate by invitation and permission. So for example, you're invited to have your cameras on. We'd love to see your faces, but that's up to you. All activities today are invitational, opt in, opt out, and part of seeking permission rather than assuming we know what other people want is liberatory practice. And that's why we try to do that in all ways possible, and we fail at it sometimes too. But we are here to represent I, not we today. It's really important for us not to generalize a universal lived experience. That's not what we're here to do. And finally, the great permission is you don't have to be prepared. You can say it however you want to say it. As communicators, we often have to be so precise and we often have to have it just right. But today, just be willing to say it authentically and to say it imperfectly. That is very, very welcome. And of course, Zoom fatigue is real. Do whatever you got to do. Take care of that body. Be comfortable. Be present. We're not robots, so no judgments here. And we're just really glad to have you here. And we will start with a little bit of grounding today as well. At Healing Solidarity, it's important to reconnect to the wisdom of our bodies and even in our breath. And we do this practice because oppressive systems, we're all navigating them, and they're all serving to disconnect us from ourselves and each other, as well as the places that hold us. So if this feels safe, if this feels available to you today, I'm just going to invite you to slow your pace, arrive, take notice of that breath, close or lower your eyes if that feels good. And I'm going to offer this little poem that came to me recently. It's one of mine. It's called Never Not Connected. All this interconnectedness bullshit breaks your heart over and over and over and over. And let me not go on. If we're meant to, if we can regain our humanity and release the dominion that we humans seem to crave so relentlessly. See how it gets so built into family, culture, religion, society. Some must be looking, noticing, ever willing to see it, name it, confront it, and not look away. Humans need more of these humans, surrendering to the grief, daily, hourly, minute by minute, which is a crucial human thing. So many have relinquished it. We need new terms for survival. We need to know more of what we need. How dare we pretend to be so singular? Let us be sorrowful, so beautiful, so deliciously dependent. Thank you. I'm just going to hand over now to Joanne to introduce our special guest. Thanks, Joanne.
Thanks, Jennifer. And hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for setting the time aside today to be with us and to be with Maimuna as well. It's such a joy, Maimuna, to have you today in this Connect session. Maimuna knows that last year I reached out to her, but it was not the right time. So this year it has worked out. So it's definitely a sign that, you know, we're meant to do this. And I'm really, really happy that you've also set aside time for today. So Maimuna Jallow is a storyteller, an editor, a playwright, and a director. And she's written and produced a range of shows. And when I got to meet her, she had just finished writing the first play, which was actually recorded on Zoom. And we'll get into that later. But she has also, you know, produced award-winning an adaptation of Lola Sheneyin's The Secret Lives of Baba Segi's Wives, which she toured internationally. And in 2021, she released her debut film, which is called The Tales of the Accidental City, an experimental feature length in which all the action takes place on Zoom. She's the editor of Story Come, an anthology of 12 African folktales, which was published in 2018. And I highly recommend it because I've read it and I've reread it. That was basically how I survived the pandemic years. In 2016, she co-founded a Nairobi-based arts and media company called Positively African. And prior to that, Maimuna also worked as a producer for the BBC World Service as Regional Communications Officer, also for Médecins Sans Frontières in the Horn of Africa region. And she holds a master's in African literature from SOAS, University of London. So just to get us started, I'm going to play a short trailer of Tales of the Accidental City, which I mentioned Maimuna produced in 2018. Is that 2018? Yes, 2021, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's do this. Can you all hear? Thumbs up would be good. Okay, all right.
You have all been sent here by the courts because they found that you have a problem with anger. And I'm here to help you learn how to deal with that anger. Are we together?
This is ridiculous. I'm surrounded by violent thugs.
Who are you calling a thug? Foma, who are you calling a thug?
Everybody, please, let's just calm down. Okay, let's calm down. Louis, I can see you stressed. I walked right up to Bonnie's face, looked at him straight in the eye, and I gave him one correct slap and boom!
I was so angry, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a big stone, and before the officers could do anything, I grabbed it and threw it at her face.
Good God.
We try to live good lives, but the city spits us out every day like cockroaches.
Close your eyes. And now put the palms of your hands on your face and start massaging those creases out slowly.
Go back to your stupid little fights with your band of thieves and continue drinking your little chai in your garden. We don't want you here anyway.
Who the hell do you think you are talking to me like that?
You people have silenced us for long enough.
You people? You people?
Yes.
I am not you people.
Yes, you are.
Safe space, safe space. Remember what I said earlier? The therapy takes place in a very sacred and safe space, okay?
What a way to end the wow. Maimuna, where did the idea for Tales of the Accidental City come from?
You know, when you just said thumbs up, Councillor Rose constantly says thumbs up if you watch the whole film. So partly the idea came from, well, later on came from all these online spaces that the pandemic kind of forced us into, and how we've been using them, you know, not only to learn, not only to have meetings, but also as safe spaces for therapy. But essentially, Tales of the Accidental City is based on 4 short stories. So we were a group of writers, and we would get together to write stories about Nairobi. And we had 8 stories finished, and we tried to publish them. We couldn't get them published. And in the end, I asked 3 of the writers if I could adapt their stories alongside my own into a stage play. And then when the script was ready, COVID happened, couldn't stage it. And that's when the idea of turning it into a film where everything happens on Zoom. Zoom became our stage. That's where the inspiration came for that.
Oh, wow. And can you tell us a little bit about, you know, because you and I met just when you had sort of finished producing it and you were at the stage where you wanted to disseminate it. Can you tell us a bit about that process, what it was like, and also how was the reception?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I haven't said hello yet. I had a whole speech prepared and you started asking me questions, so we'll go with that.
Well, we can always go back.
We'll get to it. Yeah, it was really a process because, you know, it's my first film and I didn't know very much about, you know, how the film industry works. So when I finished making the film, you know, I was going to just put it on YouTube, and my filmmaker friends were like, you don't do that, you know, you have to give value to your film by presenting it at festivals. And then you might have a chance to sell it on a, you know, on a platform. So, I mean, we only had $10,000 for the film, and that was obviously all gone. And I just basically had to invest myself into the whole film festival application process, because you have to pay to apply with no guarantee of whether you're going to get in or not. And then because it was during the pandemic, a lot of the festivals were online. But thankfully, I also managed to go to a few, like in Bilbao, in Canada. And that's just magical because, you know, at the end of the day, you create this content for an audience. And so to be able to be in the same room as them and hear them laugh or sometimes cry at the end because the end is quite poignant. And to be able to get that feedback and to see that this baby of yours actually means something to other people as well, that's just priceless. When I initially finished the film, I said, I'm never making another film. But after going through the whole process 360, I was like, it's such an important medium to communicate what we think, what we feel. And images, I've worked a lot in audio and radio, but images have this special quality to them. that really draws audiences in.
Oh, fantastic. And now that, you know, you mentioned you had a whole speech, I can't wait to hear it.
Okay, it's not too long, I promise. Let me just look for it, because I have notes as well, because if not, I tend to go on and on and on. Oh gosh, and just now it's disappeared. Just 1 second. Here we go. So hello again, everyone. You know, I'm just really happy to be here, because from looking back at other episodes, other sessions of the Healing Solidarity Network, I just realized that, you know, this is a real community of communicators, yes, but also storytellers, activists, feminists, and people who are always questioning and challenging the status quo, which often means that sometimes we're battered and bruised. So it's really great to meet today in this space that's dedicated to healing and to solidarity and to helping us live our life with purpose. So Joanne and Jennifer, thank you so much for inviting me. When I was preparing for this presentation, I looked back at other editions and I was so impressed with the people who'd presented before, but also particularly with this thing, Jennifer, that you say in the introduction, which is about going from charity to solidarity, because it's something that I really, really deeply identify with. So that's kind of, and then when you talk about it's not necessarily a safe space, but a brave space, I decided to be brave and tell my story and this journey really from a perspective that I don't always share. So as you mentioned in your intro, Joan, I was a journalist. I shifted to NGO comms, and then finally I started, you know, working on more artistic, creative projects like the film Tales of the Accidental City. And I want to focus a bit this presentation of why I made that shift. And honestly, for me, it was a matter of literally preserving my sanity. I've always loved words and stories. And as a child, I really got lost in books. They were my safe place. So I don't think it was a surprise for anyone when I became a journalist. And so I started off my career at the BBC World Service, more specifically the African Service, as a producer and then later as a foreign correspondent. And I guess, like, as happens to many journalists covering developing countries, in the end, I transitioned into working in the communications department of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders in Kenya. For me, the biggest shift that brought about is that when you transition from being a journalist to a comms officer, you go from reporting the story to trying to sell the story. So the shift in role was huge for me. But what I found was that the narrative didn't seem to change very much. What I mean is that, you know, whilst I loved working at the BBC, I love that adrenaline of fast-paced live news broadcast. There were not many opportunities to go very deep. I got to produce a few documentaries, but generally in the newsroom, you have 1 to 3 minutes to tell a story. So a lot of times it felt kind of surface level. And after a while, that started to bother me. But I think what bothered me most was just the constant reporting on disaster, disease, political turmoil, day in, day out. And, you know, we all know the old adage, no news is good news. My mom always says that. But I also found this deeply problematic. And I argued a lot with my editors who simply said, look, something has to happen for it to be news, and generally it has to be something bad. So today, I think that's shifting, because with online platforms and the changing ways in which people consume news means that there's just so much more content out there in the digital sphere. But when I started out 20 years ago, this wasn't the case. At MSF, the narrative was the same. And I guess that's simply a reality of what it's like to work for a medical humanitarian organization, often working in emergencies. You are there to draw attention to people's suffering in the hope that the world will wake up and do something about it. And I really remember how a few months after joining MSF, famine was declared in Somalia.
And we'd seen it coming. We'd seen increasing numbers of people crossing the border into Kenya, arriving in a terrible, terrible state. And we'd been trying to tell journalists to report on it, but their response was, these refugees are coming from Somalia. Somalia is a place that's had issues for so many years, and the Dadaab refugee camp has been there for so long, it's not newsworthy. And then overnight, when the UN officially declared famine, we literally had hundreds of journalists knocking at our doors, asking for access to go and cover the story. And I was angry, cynical. I remember one photographer asking me if I could guarantee him a money shot, by which he meant a photograph of a child on the verge of death, as though this child had no parents or siblings, or that this child's life didn't matter. And I really began to question the value of what I was doing with this organization. Were we really contributing to policy change, to change on the ground, or were we just pawns in a game of poverty porn, helping foreign correspondents win Pulitzers? It felt like we were simply putting bandages over rotting flesh, but never getting to the root cause of the problem. And perhaps that wasn't our job, but for me as an African who got into this work, wanting to contribute to the prosperity of my continent, and who believes that governments ultimately are the ones who have to be held accountable, and someone who grew up with a very Pan-Africanist father who always talked about African solutions to African problems, I wasn't sure that this charity was taking us anywhere. And the truth is, I no longer wanted to be part of what Teju Cole so aptly calls the white savior industrial complex. I was depressed. I couldn't get some of the images of suffering and death out of my head. I felt hopeless. I felt helpless. And then I couldn't even fall back to my writing, which was my safe zone, because everything I wrote was so grim. And so I left. And I went back to source, so to speak. I dug deep. I remember that I had done a master's in African literature, and that stories were really my love. So I went to Zanzibar to collect traditional folk tales. And then I ran this online contest, inviting writers from across the continent to reimagine traditional folk tales. And we published the Story Come anthology that Joan mentioned in the introduction. I founded Positively African, and we produce so many things: theater plays, poetry events, storytelling workshops for kids in slums. And we even produced 2 international storytelling festivals. And we'll share the link to Positively African on the chat, just so that you can see the kind of work that we were doing. But even as I made this transition, I have to admit that a part of me questioned whether I had chickened out from doing serious work, you know, saving lives by telling the story of Brenda in Kibera, who can now access ARVs, but still lives in abject poverty. But the truth is that activism is part of who I am. And like many of us here, I'm ultimately driven by a desire to leave the world a better place than I found it. And I had to learn how to give equal value to my creative projects. Folktales are not just stories. They're just a vital form of life. They transmit values. They help us preserve indigenous knowledge systems. And they are a way to ensure broader representation, I think, as well: race, gender, and so on. And then when I started adapting novels by African women into performances, these stories also had powerful messages. They forced audiences to think about how we treat women in society. For example, in The Secret Lives of Baba Segi's Wives, you know, you're confronted with the stories of these women who are only valued in society if they can have children. But the women are also funny and cunning, and they're not just victims, but full human beings who experience all emotions like you and I do. And then with the film Tales of the Accidental City, you're also confronted with characters who bear their souls and tell us the stories of how they came to the city in the hope of a better life, or how they tried to change the system, but were unable to defeat entrenched, corrupt politicians, or even how they just, wanted true love but were deceived. And in the film, I use humor, but I also raise important issues because it's a film about corruption. It's a film about neocolonial mind frames, about class. And so through this work, I'm finally able to tell stories that matter to me on a personal level. It has been a real healing process because finally I feel like my brain, my heart, my soul, they're aligned. And today I still freelance as a comms consultant, but I also work with young artists, with women's groups, and I help them tell their own stories or co-create new works of art. And I, of course, continue to write and produce for theater and film. And the reality is maybe I'm not changing the world, but I hope that I'm telling stories that are nuanced and that don't deny people their humanity or turn them into useful statistics for a news story or a donor report. Imperfect as they may be, I'm finally proud of the stories that I now choose to tell. Thank you very much.
Wow. Amazing. That is so it's just, to me, it sounds very wholesome and it very inspiring at the same time. And I see lots of hearts, also just a lot of people resonating with what you've shared, Maimuna. This is so brilliant. Yes, thank you so much.
I was worried because, we work in, many of us work in this industry, let's say, so you don't want to bash it. And yet so many of us have so many contradictions that we live with constantly because of the kind of work that we do. I think that everybody that starts with this work starts it because you have this passion and you want to contribute to society and want to change things for a greater good. And sometimes you lose yourself in it and you don't recognize yourself. And for me, I had to really step back, and I found that being free to create what I want to create with the messages that I want to create has allowed me to combine those storytelling skills, but with something that I feel is more true to me. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think a lot of us also in this space, we have some sort of creativity that is sort of bubbling under as communicators. In your case, how do you nourish your creativity? How were you able to protect it, especially when you had to tell all these stories?
For a long time, I didn't protect it. So for my sort of 16 years in journalism and then NGO communications, and then afterwards I ran a contest for journalists, basically giving them grants to do more development stories. That was, a Bill and Melinda Gates project. So 16 years I was in there, and it's so funny that when I decided to just stop for a while, literally just to preserve my mental health, and started thinking about what I wanted to do. First, I was just spurred by, the fact that I had a young child, and I was looking for traditional stories to tell him, and I couldn't find them very easily. So I thought, where are these stories going? I'm going to go in search of them. But also, honestly, suddenly I was like, actually, Maimuna, you forget that you majored in African literature. I had literally forgotten that there was this whole, so I thought I was doing something new rather than realizing that I was actually going full circle back to what I really loved. But initially I had basically stopped all of that for such a long time that I had to remind myself that I could still, write fiction and use my imagination and not just report. Yeah. Wonderful. And where do I find the stories, did you say?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Everywhere. Everywhere. I mean, I think there are stories everywhere. It can be something that you watch that sparks you. It can be something that you read. It can be something that you witness. I mean, I just think stories are everywhere. The difficulty is in choosing which ones to go with, right? And for me, for example, with The Secret Lives of Baba Segi's Wives, I was reading the novel at the same time as I was exploring oral literature and traditional storytelling. And it literally jumped off the page at me. And I said, this is the story that I want to bring to audiences. Number one, because it's such a beautiful book and many people don't read. So it was, how do we create greater access through performance? But also because the way Lola Shoneyin writes is so oral that it was just a natural, thing to happen. So really, I've always been guided by a bit of serendipity and intuition, and then whatever sticks. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, I really want to open the discussion also to questions from our community today. So please feel free to unmute and ask Maimuna any of the questions which I'm sure you have. Is there anyone who would like to go ahead and ask a question right now?
Or make a comment.
Yeah.
Share your views.
Well, something that you said that really resonated with me, Maimuna, is that your activism requires you to touch that creativity, that it is actually that original motivation, that original draw towards the sector that then gets lost in the sector, that then sort of have to return to and reclaim for yourself. It really, really, really resonates. And yeah, I wondered if you have more to say about that marriage of activism and creativity.
I mean, I remember being in school and us having this debate about whether all literature had to be littérature engagée, as the French call it, engaged literature, whether it had to have a kind of political message or a social message. And even then, and I was quite young when we were having this debate, I remember thinking, but if it's not, then what is it? And of course, art for art's sake and for beauty's sake, yes. But I just don't know how you separate the two. I just feel that for a lot of us, as you say, what the driving force, is seeing something that we want to change, or witnessing an injustice and saying, how can we react to that? How can we put that in words? How can we get other people to understand what is happening? So for me, I just think that personally, and also as a Black African woman, I don't know how I can create any work that isn't rooted in that identity. And it's funny I say that because at the same time, I was in Kenya for 11 years and I moved to Spain about a year and a half ago. And initially I was quite annoyed that I kept being asked to talk about racism, because I was like, just because I'm a Black woman doesn't mean that the only thing I can talk about is racism. So, there's the two sides to the coin, where in the West, you're basically labeled as something, and therefore, you seem to have no opinion about anything else, or you can't simply talk about beauty. And, I love these movements that are saying, let's talk about Black joy, let's focus on that, because that's the only way we stay, alive. And with my work, even now, this last film is quite a heavy one, but the new work that I'm creating is all about joy. It's a musical play, possibly an animation, and it's all about celebrating real African women heroes who fought against imperialism, but told through the eyes of, these two children on an adventure. And it's very beautiful, and the costuming and everything, but I needed some joy. So yeah, it's important to find the balance, because if not, if as activists we burn out completely, then we're no use to anybody, and especially not to ourselves. And I found myself in that rabbit hole.
Yeah. I'm just going to take us back to international organizations and storytelling, particularly now, when we're talking about decolonization, anti-oppression work. Maimuna, what do you think, for people working in these international organizations, what do they need to understand about creativity and storytelling when they're thinking about anti-oppression work and decolonization? Because you just mentioned about the joy aspect, and I think that is, but I'm gonna let you.
That's critical, yeah. But also for me, a big one is this thing, pass the mic, because we always feel like we can speak for other people. And a lot of organizations are spending a lot of time making sure that they're not, there's a shift. They don't just want to portray the white doctor, for example, saving the little black baby. No, they're trying to make sure that that the black nurse is also featured. So that's good because it creates optically a change of perception. Although, I mean, I was shocked coming back to Spain to still see the big billboards with, starving children. I was like, I thought that had stopped, but you still see it. So that's one thing, but I think it needs to go further, and people, we need to pass the mic. People say, oh, women don't have a voice. They do have a voice. You just don't listen to them, or you don't allow them to speak. And it always is difficult because it means you have to relinquish some of your power and some of your privilege and hand it to somebody else. But for me, that's the fundamental work, realizing that people can speak for themselves and giving them the opportunity to do that. It doesn't mean you can't still have solidarity and that you can't co-create things, but really listening to people and allowing them to speak in their own words and not going with a preconceived idea of what they should say, And I think that in terms of communications, for international organizations, that is still lacking.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the pushback that I often come in contact with when it comes to, revising the narratives and the images that are being used in the sector is particularly from the fundraising departments, because then often it's like, so you want me to show happy pictures and you want me to get, like, how do you want me to get money if I'm showing happy pictures, or if I'm showing, pictures of also Black and Brown people with agency? So what do you have to say to people who still think like that?
It's a hard one, but I mean, for me, it's like when I was talking about working in a newsroom, that there's so little depth. It's the same thing when you're running a campaign and you need a one sentence slogan and one image, and you can't provide a lot of depth. So what do you go for? The most sort of shocking, the most heartstring pulling kind of image. But I think that we have to look at the long-term repercussions of that, and then maybe give people just a little bit more, just believe that people don't need to see a dying, starving baby or on a big billboard to feel solidarity. We're seeing people, crossing the Mediterranean Sea, and we see them dying on arrival and at sea. That hasn't changed. That doesn't change the Italian policy that's trying to keep migrants out. It doesn't change the kind of institutional racism which doesn't regulate these kinds of people when they move to European country. So actually, I don't think that seeing the dying, desperate images even works anymore. People are just tired, and people are struggling with their own struggles. So yeah, I just think, I don't know, for me, I also, the whole fundraising idea, because I remember with MSF, when Dadaab, when there was the big influx of refugees into Dadaab, I remember saying, Dadaab is 600 kilometers from Nairobi. And even in Nairobi, people don't know what's happening there. We need to do some fundraising campaigns locally. And at the time, the response was, we don't fundraise in Africa. We do projects in Africa, and we fundraise in Europe. So it's still that idea that we as Africans cannot be part of the solutions. And that's just so deeply problematic, because there are people that do want to help, and we have to be, at the end of the day, we have to be, part of the solution. I don't think any nation in the world has, developed fully on external aid. And that aid is not unconditional aid. So that's why here, when my friends, are talking about migration issues, I say, lobby your government. Your government is the one that is trolling with massive ships on the coast of Senegal, which is why people no longer have a livelihood and have to cross the Mediterranean to come here. Spain is the third largest seller of weapons on the continent. The guys who are coming from Sudan, South Sudan, are coming probably because your government sold weapons to people there. So deal with your root causes. Let us deal with the rest. You know what I mean? I think we'll go further that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you 100%, especially when it comes to addressing the root causes and sort of taking a much broader perspective to the issues, as opposed to, it's just about our little organization or little fundraising department and raising money. No, the repercussions are far reaching. So Faith Rose is basically saying that she is she's looking forward to diving into your work, and she loves folk tales and accompanying songs to young people in the diaspora. Yeah. Let's have a look. Okay, there's another comment from Baluko Joe, and she says, it starts from the heart, showing empathy and respect for others. Organizations need to realize that everybody has potential and has a contribution to make. Yes, absolutely. Maimuna,
and we
yeah,
think, sorry, I was just going to say, and we think that it's changing a lot, but I was recently visiting a project in Senegal, and I won't divulge who it was, but it was, the director of a massive funding institution, probably one of the biggest in the country. And we were having a conversation, and he was like, I really don't know if we should pay African artists the same as European artists when they're co-collaborating, because, they'll be earning more than they've ever earned in their life. And, and everyone's always knocking on my door asking for money. I was stunned, that this man had so much power, so much privilege, that he wasn't aware of what he was saying. So what if this guy is getting more than before? Allow him the agency to then decide what he's going to invest that money into. So I said to him, oh, but imagine if they had told you in your home country, we can't send him to Africa because there he's going to have domestic help, a driver, his schools paid for his kids in private school. We don't think he'll be able to manage that. I mean, it's exactly the same thing, right? We all have moments of luck and privilege and all of that. Let that artist decide what they're going to do. But I found it so condescending, so condescending. And recently I was invited again on a panel to talk about, racism here in Spain. And, they invited 4 amazing women and then gave us 20 minutes. Okay, that's racist in itself. You obviously are not interested in anything that we have to say if you've given 4 women 20 minutes to debate an issue like that. So it's these aggressions that are constant and that people need to look at and question. It's not enough to say, well, we've hosted, a debate on racism. That makes us extremely woke. Have you really? What was the intention? Was it just publicity? It felt like it was.
Yeah. There's still a lot of that definitely ongoing in the sector, the tick the box kind of exercise that, Is there anyone who would like to chime in and comment and ask Maimuna a question? You're welcome. We'd love to hear from you.
And I must say, I agree completely with Mbakulo. It starts from the heart, showing empathy and respect.
Yeah, as you're speaking, Maimuna, I'm also thinking about something that I've said publicly a lot in the whole poverty porn debate. I don't know if that debate is the right word for it. Conditions of whatever. But trust the audience more. That is the thing that I would like to say to every fundraising director, vice president, the world is opening. There is no reason that your supporter can't hop on to some social media platform and hear directly from people who are impacted by whatever issue you're making fundraising, for. So now, given that, if you are actually building a base that is globally engaged, and that's what you're aiming to do, and to think of it as community building, base building, understanding that, and not treating donors transactionally, that has to be part of this, right? Trust them and respect them too. Respect that they have enough they don't want to be treated like cash machines. They actually want to be engaged and feel like they're part of something bigger. We have the tremendous opportunity as INGO people to offer that in a meaningful way, in a prolonged way, that is it's such a sad thing for me to leave that on the table in these discussions, because that actually is the sustainability financially that organizations will need as well. So yeah, trust the audience. Trust that they want to learn and can learn, right?
Yeah. And it's not a mistake that just fundraising departments make, even with television content, with people who, big platforms who buy content from filmmakers, they keep churning out the sort of reality show stuff, the Survivor kind of program. And they say, well, that's because that's what sells. And I say, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. If you never give them any other content, how do you know that they won't be interested in that as well? We just don't give people enough credit. And as you're saying, people are discerning, people are able to make decisions on their own. So give them respect as well. Yeah,
Absolutely. And Maimuna, when it comes to just speaking to a group of communicators like ourselves today, what advice do you have, particularly for us who are trying to shift or revise narratives about the African continent for audiences in these rich countries? And I'm really curious if, the advice also differs for Black women like myself and for white women as well, because I think sometimes there can be slight differences. Yeah.
Advice in terms of communicating?
Yeah, in terms of the storytelling, that we are engaged in the bigger goal of shifting narratives about the African continent.
Yeah. I don't know. I've left that world to do what I want to do, I don't know. It's hard. I do think that, a lot of the times when we focus on communications, a key thing whenever an organization is communicating is say, know who your audience is, right? And a lot of the time we're always looking at audiences in the West, I guess, where the money is. And we often forget audiences on the African continent, or if you're working, for example, in a project in India, then in the Indian subcontinent, local audiences also really matter. And I think that we don't pay enough attention to that because we don't see that as a source of cash. But at the end of the day, this is the community in which these issues are taking place. And the reality is that someone in Accra probably knows more about what's happening in Chicago than they do know what's happening in Nairobi. We as Africans, we don't know each other. That has been a deliberate policy since colonial times, one that has been maintained by our inept leaders, where, it's easier to go from Nairobi to London than it is to go from Nairobi to Banjul. So we're really not interconnected ourselves. And I think that that is part of the problem. I think that if we could have more unity across the African continent and within the diaspora as well, that perhaps we'll be able to put forth solutions that work better for us, that are solutions that we have come up with ourselves. I see this now, and I'm sorry, I don't think I'm answering your question, but just we'll finish this point. I see this now that I've moved to Spain. All my work is very Afrocentric. But now, because I no longer have an address on the African continent, I don't qualify for any kind of support to do that work, And I say, why are you splitting us? Us as diaspora, we're part of the African continent, Somebody in Brazil, that has the second largest population of Black people outside of Africa should be able to engage with the African continent in a meaningful way, because there's more that unites us than separates us. But we're still working with these, borders that are false and this sort of global North, global South dichotomy, when I think that we need to be looking laterally as well. Last year, I worked on a residency and we had artists from India, for example. We had so much to share with them, more than we did, for example, maybe an artist in Germany. Although they were part of it, it was wonderful. We all managed to work together. But it was so nice to have that connection going in that direction as well. And next year, we want to do it with people in Brazil. I gave a workshop in Brazil to young Black and Indigenous artists and activists last year. And it was, the connection between us was just so powerful. And the kind of social issues that we still face today, the poverty, the discrimination, and all of that, we could understand each other in a way that if we had been having this discussion with, let's say, Australia, there wouldn't necessarily have been the same connection unless maybe it was an Aboriginal community. So what I mean is, we need to rethink of how we collaborate, who we collaborate with, who our audience is. And I don't know if this is the role of INGOs, but maybe in the communication, really rethink whether the audience is just a Western audience or also a local audience or a diasporic audience, but that we have to be interconnected and we have to be part of the solution. We're tired of begging, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I can see we're just 3 minutes till 5 o'clock, at least where I'm at. And there's one question from Jama Jack, and she would like to know, Maimuna, if you have any practices that help you to ground yourself in your values, especially in the face of a reality where you're being told what you create isn't really what sells or draws big audiences. Any self-affirming practices, approaches that help you stay on your lane?
Yeah. I think, you know, more and more as I get older, community, the value of community is huge. And I say that knowing that sometimes it can be very difficult to have community. I've moved around so much that sometimes I feel like I don't have community. But recently I was in Senegal and I went to visit this Ndem village where you have the Murid Baifal, the Murid Brotherhood, the Sufi Islam group, and they basically created this community where they all support each other in a way that I haven't seen live in a very long time. And I realized that a lot of the time, at least in my work, I have to validate what validates what I'm doing is if I can convince a funder to see any worth in it and invest in it, which is very hard. And you often get a lot of rejections. And now I realize that I'm not going to put myself in the position where I define the value of what I do according to whether I get money for it. I'm going to start collaborating with people regardless, because I have a massive community of artists, be it musicians, choreographers, writers, who are willing to walk the journey with me, you know, that we can co-collaborate even whilst we wait for the money to come and all of that. That's important. And another exercise that I've done this year has been to revise and review my values. I think because I've reached sort of 7 years that I've gone freelance and that I'm working on artistic projects. And I was in this rat race of how do I angle this so that I can get money from here? And how do I do this so that this audience, and I had to stop. And this year I did a 3-month online course that made me really go back to my values. What are they? Am I working with people who share the same values as me? You know, if honesty is very important to me, am I working with people who are honest? If loyalty is very important to me, am I working with people who are loyal? And that has been a really important exercise because I feel like I'm the captain of my ship, you know, because sometimes with this creative work, you're kind of like, wherever the money comes from, then I have to shift it to this or that. And I'm trying to be a lot more intentional about what I do, have more confidence in what I'm doing, and to say, it will work, you know, stick to what you're doing. Of course, you know, you have to be open to ideas, etc. But yeah, making sure that you have a community around you and that you're living in line with your values, your own values.
Yeah. In alignment, 100%. Yeah. Mbakulo says, I think it's better to be honest at all times, leave alone being blinded by the need for funding. Community support and sustainability make more sense in reality for anybody with a conscience. Yes. Okay. We have just clocked in 1 hour. Thank you so much, Maimuna. Really, it's been such a joy, so much inspiration. It was it's just exceptional, and I just feel like I could continue listening to you, just telling also the stories that you just came across while in Senegal 2 weeks ago. I guess it's about 2 weeks ago, so it's all still very fresh. But I just want to thank you very much for being with us today. And we've just started sharing in the chat also that for those who are interested, there's a film that Maimuna did. It's called Journey to Paradise. And we invite you to watch it, particularly, in terms of having a good example of how storytelling and the arts are very, very important to question the world around us and to rethink our core values. So please
And I didn't make the film,
Okay.
but it's a wonderful Kenyan filmmaker, and I was the artistic co-creative director of a artistic residency that he filmed and then made the film. But I think it's really inspiring what he did. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There's still a couple more comments in the chat, so please keep an eye on that as well. I think people are just not for you, Maimuna, but for everyone else. So just pace you with that. Yes, so we welcome you to also join another Healing Solidarity space, which is particularly for people of color, and it's held by our fabulous colleague Sarah Diedro Jordao. So we're going to share that also in the chat. And if you have any suggestions for our upcoming guests, or if you would like to also, take over the session, please feel free to reach out to Jennifer and myself, and, we can co-create this next session or future Global Dev Communicators Connect with you, because we want you to feel like you have a big say in this. Yeah, not just a say, but a big say in this as well. Yeah. And thank you again, everyone. And if you would like to support the Healing Solidarity, you are definitely welcome to do that as well. We'll just share in the chat also the different ways that you can support the Healing Solidarity Collective. Yes, yeah. And with that, we're going to close our meeting. Thank you so much, Maimuna.
Thank you so much.
Yes. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Joanne, you can stop recording now.
Oh yeah, sure.